Pastor Monica, earlier this year at an ad council meeting, you reminded us that next year, 2017, will be the 130th anniversary of our incorporation as a Methodist Episcopal Church in West Grove. So at your invitation, and I appreciate that, we're going to sit down and talk a little bit about the history of our church. We'll look at things like who were those first people that gathered in a private home in West Grove for class meetings? When did they buy land? When did they build our first church? And then when did we as a group of believers have the faith to build this new church here and to move from our comfortable little chapel on the hill on Prospect Avenue to this location which we're sitting today. But before we get started, can you help me understand a little bit about when did the Methodist Church come to the United States, and really how did Methodism come to be in Chester County, Pennsylvania?
John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist movement and came over to the colonies for around 1735, 1737 as a missionary to Georgia. It was a failed experiment, but it was the first entree from the Church of England, John Wesley's Methodist movement, over to the colonies. So it was later, the 1760s, that multiple Methodist preachers, there were Methodists by that point in England, came to share some of that enthusiasm over in the American colonies. So it was even in Chester County, here in this area, in 1769, that Francis Asbury, the great preacher, came to a site now known as Grove Church, right up the street outside of Westchester, and then Hopewell United Methodist Church in Guthriesville, where they stood and preached in that place. They were just the beginning of a Methodist movement that thrived in the Revolution and grew up alongside the American understanding, our young country. As these villages grew, Sunday schools and churches began to spring up everywhere.
You know, your last point about churches springing up around growing villages relates a lot and is very relevant to our story as West Grove United Methodists. In our case, the year is 1885, and West Grove is still part of London Grove Township at that point. It's not its own incorporated borough. It's in the middle of a building boom. There's lots of employment in the area. We have the rose business. We have a casket factory under construction. We have quarries on each side of town. So there's opportunity for employment. And actually West Grove started growing in about 1860 when the railroad came through town. So with that railroad came increased businesses and then residents and people. At that point, there was a number of residents from West Grove actually attending the Avondale Methodist Church. And around 1885, they decided that it was time for West Grove to have its own Methodist organization. So in November 1885, a small group of believers gathered in a private home, actually in the home of Martin and Louisa Benn at 29 Oakland Avenue in the center of town, for a series of Thursday evening meetings. They actually called them class meetings, meetings of religious instruction. That first night in November 1885, Reverend Charles Langley, who was pastor of Avondale Methodist, he attended that first class meeting to give them words of encouragement. And the local newspapers actually said that he spoke to the group and he provided them with, quote, some earnest words of counsel. There was actually 11 people at that first class meeting in the Benn home on Oakland Avenue. So 11 officially enrolled, and they appointed Martin Benn as the class leader. And so these Methodist class meetings, held in a private residence on Oakland Avenue in West Grove, became the foundation for our present-day church.
I love hearing about the class meetings. So as John Wesley began the Methodist movement in England, he began as a methodical way of understanding our spirituality. And part of his methodical way was that individuals would go to their churches to receive the sacraments, but would meet in a class setting, small groups, in homes and in factories, and they would ask the question, how is it with your soul? They would receive spiritual instruction, much as the ones did at the Benn home here in West Grove. It's a great delight to celebrate that the Benn family are the great-grandparents of Dorothy Weeks, long-time member here. Dorothy was so proud of that connection, and she made it a point that each and every time a pastor came within her 96 years of life, she was here on that first Sunday to tell that story.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So within a year, the group actually outgrew the Ben home. The group was too large to be meeting anymore in a private residence. So they moved to the second floor of the K&P building, which is on the eastern side of Exchange Place in the center of town, in the center of West Grove. The K&P building is actually the building that today houses Brothers Pizza on the first floor. So we were meeting in the second floor of the K&P building, which actually had just been built a year earlier in 1885. So the group moved there, and at about the time they moved into the K&P building, they began Sunday worship service in addition to the Thursday evening class meetings. So although at this point we didn't have a church building, we did actually, the group operated under all the terms, as much as they could under the terms of the Methodist Book of Discipline, and they even went so far as to appoint a board of trustees. And like today, those trustees had primary responsibility for facilities and buildings, and so the trustees went to work very quickly to try to find a site on which to build a new church. And in October 1886, they purchased a half-acre lot at the corner of Prospect and Hillside Avenues in the southern section of the village of West Grove. They actually bought the land from two different families. The one family, or obtained the land from two different families. The one family was Mr. and Mrs. Charles Ryan, and they were actually members of the Methodist congregation, so the Ryans donated their land, and the other half of the property was owned by a Quaker family, last name Chambers, and they sold the land to the Methodist congregation for $320. So that's October 1886, we buy land. The next year, 1887, was a very busy year for the congregation. We established our Sunday school program in 1887 and appointed Mr. John Hackenberg, who was principal of the West Grove High School, as our first Sunday school superintendent. In November of 1887, the group officially incorporated as the Methodist Episcopal Church of West Grove. The opening preamble to the church charter was actually signed by 16 subscribers, so 16 people signed on. It was both males and females as to our Articles of Incorporation. And that charter said the following, quote, "Be it known that the subscribers with their associates formed a congregation in the village of West Grove for the purposes of worshiping Almighty God according to the faith, doctrines, discipline, and usages of the Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States." So with incorporation came our first pastor. He was Reverend Samuel Pancoast. He actually served three churches. He served on a circuit that included Avondale, West Grove, and Chatham Methodist Church.
I think it's so interesting, Scott, how early this church incorporated, that founding fathers and mothers of this congregation found the organization, the method of being a church so important. I've served churches that have gone decades, even centuries, actually, without incorporating. It's unique, too, to hear of the trustees coming so early in the process, such a high value on the method and organization that John Wesley would have smiled very proudly on. It's a small group, a faithful few, 11, you said, that met in a private home, growing into the vibrant congregation that we've had over these 130 years.
I agree, Pastor Monica. You think about what our founding fathers and mothers accomplished in just a 2-year period of time, between 1885 and 1887. We incorporated, we bought land, we established a Sunday school program, and we welcomed our first pastor. So I think the next time we talk, we're going to look at the building of our first church up on Prospect Avenue.